So, for those of you who don't know, my name is Yvonne Wren. I'm the Director of Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit. And today, it's great that we've got some of our past directors who are here to join us in the celebration. And we're going to hear shortly from Rebecca Palmer. Before that, I'm going to introduce somebody who is well known to all of you. That's Professor Pam Enderby, OBE. Who's going to tell us a little bit about how the unit started and its history.
I was wondering whether I was going to pen you in.
I'll go now. I'm going to turn this. Yes.
She's going to escape. I'm very honoured to present to you today and to welcome you all, and thank you very much for coming. We're talking about research 40 years ago in speech and language therapy. How much research was being done? Not a lot, but there was research in linguistics, there was research in phonetics. But the clinical application of research was very sadly lacking. And several of us working at Frenchay picked up on a phrase from Thomas Edison. And he said, "I've not been wrong, but I've found 10,000 ways that don't work." And that was interesting because he went on to say that the problems are still there. And in speech and language therapy, we were feeling there are problems there, we're trying this, we're trying that, but some of it's not working. So how can we take that forward? So the Frenchay Speech and Language Therapy Unit started to do research, explore a little bit in ways that are almost embarrassing now. I look at my PhD and I think, God, honestly, I'm glad nobody's looking at that nowadays. Because it was so basic, and it was so much based on pure science and that science direction. And human factors weren't involved. And as soon as you get science and human factors together, there won't be 10,000 ways of getting it wrong. There will be 20,000 ways, because that combination is so challenging of getting the science right and the human factors right. So we started out on our research, and some of it was very basic and interesting. I remember doing the cost effectiveness of donuts on the ward rounds, and this was not published in a highly cited journal, but having donuts in the ward round is cost effective because the ward rounds are shorter. People don't go on about things that they don't need to go on. They are more pithy. And also the lead consultant usually isn't quite such a prat when he's got sugar and jam on his mouth. So we learned something even from that early research. And so we started to venture into getting funding for other aspects of research, but we ran out of space in the unit. But we didn't want to be disconnected from the clinical base. I've always had, and I know that many of you share, this disappointment. So much research has no impact on research. The world of research is here, and the world of clinical practice is here. And sometimes we try to meld these, but sometimes the researchers don't know the questions, and the clinicians aren't understanding the answers. So we wanted the unit to stay very much clinically focused and clinically based. And then I met a person from the Underwood Trust who started to invest in our research. Very interested in communication disorders, very interested in what we wanted to do. That allowed us to start on feasibility trials, to extend our work with other people who knew about research. You know, this was quite an interesting area, goodness gracious. Ethics wasn't really a big problem then. Those were the days. You know, and some of the things that I look back on that we did, we would never be allowed to do. One of the research projects was looking at taking photographs of everybody on the stroke unit and asking the patients which ones they liked. I'm not entirely sure that would get through ethics now, but we found that mostly the patients really liked the younger members of staff, and as you got older, they liked you less. It's a bit disappointing to me now. But the fact that the issue to do with that was that they liked the responsivity of a younger person who was shocked by their problem, who, if you were sick in the bed, didn't just think, oh, bloody hell, another person sick in the bed and go that and down and whatever. They would fuss. And they liked that fuss. So we went on to more challenging bits of research, and at that time the Underwood Trust invested in our setting up of the unit, which we're celebrating today, its 30th anniversary. Many of you will know that unit did not have running water or toilets. I say this was done on purpose, and I stand by that, because it meant that all the researchers had to go over to the clinical unit and have a wee. And, you know, that's a good way of having a chat, women in a loo, and chat about an amazing amount of things. So we kept it with the fact that we couldn't afford the water connection. I never told anyone. It was just because it was a direction for the unit. So the unit has grown, and it's had several directors now, and it has grown in its strength and its standing. And it's a great pleasure that we are going to see now and hear from one of my colleagues, Yvonne. She's going to lead into our talk of the day, Rebecca's talk, and that will show how the small start in the unit has ended up with a very large NIHR grant. So the unit has still got this completely unique character of looking at practical problems of interest to clinicians, trying to ensure that the way that they disseminate the results has an impact on clinicians and takes research forward. I'd like to particularly pay homage to Underwood Trust, who have again said that they will continue to invest in the unit. A small amount, but it's the amount you need to sustain the unit. It's the amount that gives you confidence to go on. And we would really like to change the name of the unit in the near future to the Underwood unit, because they've been so influential in what we've been able to do and have really changed the world of our research locally and perhaps more nationally as well. Yvonne, I'd like you to come back now to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. Okay, as I'm talking, I'm going to try and get Rebecca's presentation up so that we lose that one and the right one comes up. Is that looking right? Not quite, is it? But this should do it. Nearly. Okay, fine. Now, just a brief introduction to Rebecca. So, Dr. Rebecca Palmer, who is Leader in Communications and Stroke Rehabilitation at Sheffield University. Now, Rebecca has always been at Sheffield University, but I do remember meeting you a long time ago when you came to the unit in your early career research days. And Rebecca's going to talk to us about the big CACTUS project. And now, those of you who know or work in aphasia will be very familiar with this study, I'm sure. Rebecca's going to talk us through it. But actually, the thing that I thought was of particular interest to us today is about the process that Rebecca went through to achieve this study, to see it through from its early days to completion. When I've known about the study from the start and all the way through and heard updates and things, but a few months ago, quite a few months ago now, because it was before I invited you, I saw Rebecca's YouTube video about the study now that it has completed, and you're going to show some bits of that today. And what really impressed me was how Rebecca had been able to get an IHR funding, which is a challenge for anybody, to run a trial in speech and language therapy. Another huge challenge. Anybody who's been here and who's tried to achieve that, it's a big deal. But it was more than that, because Rebecca had been able to do this as a multi-centre trial. And I'm involved with a cohort study which involves multiple centres, and I know the challenges that are involved in trying to get initially ethical approval and then HRA approval to enable that multi-centre activity, and it's huge. And you're able to do that, and then the icing on the cake was really the PPI, so the patient and public involvement in the CACTUS. And I think the way that Rebecca did that was I was just hugely impressed by. And that's why we've invited Rebecca here today. Yes, it's to talk about aphasia, it's to talk about speech and language therapy, but it's also to understand a bit more about that process of carrying out and succeeding in research in speech and language therapy. So I hope you'll now join hands to welcome Rebecca with me as she comes to talk to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel really honoured to be asked to do the Underwood Trust Lecture, and I think it's the first one, isn't it? Hopefully of many. So thank you ever so much for that invitation. And I want to start, I will talk about the project, but I want to start about telling you about my first memories associated with coming down to the Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit. So I'd just finished my first post as a speech and language therapist in North Lincolnshire, and I was fortunate enough to get a research role with Professor Enderby at the University of Sheffield. And in my first few weeks in that new job, she took me on a journey down to this unit. So I was very excited about this. And on the train, and I have to say it was very early in the morning, I think you'll remember, Pam persuaded me to sign up to do a PhD. It was very early in the morning, as I say. And that was fine. But then when we arrived at the unit, I think Pam was then a little bit alarmed to see my keen interest in somebody's baby that they brought into the unit. I think it might have been one of yours, Yvonne. And Pam reminded me that I had just signed up to do a PhD and I needed to hand the baby back. So I'm delighted to be back here in Bristol, nearly 16 years later. I have completed my PhD, and this evening I've brought with me my very own baby. So it's great to be back. The unit has been, it's really unique in that it's all about improving the lives of people with communication difficulties, and that's been from creating, developing and testing out new assessments, so we know what the difficulty is that an individual has, to different types of treatment, and through to Pam's important work on outcome measures, so that we know the impact that our speech and language therapy is having, and what works better than something else, and where something works better in one place than another place. But I put this picture up here of what now look to us like some fairly old computers, I think. And this is because one of the streams of research here with Pam and with Brian, who I think somewhere in the audience, was that they recognised really early on the potential that computers had for delivering speech and language therapy. And in fact, if you read some of the early papers, they actually called them microcomputers, and I think that just goes to show how ahead of their time they were. So they went on to different things that have been developed at the unit. There's the phoneme factory assessment software for children's speech, which was led by Yvonne. And then there's the Stroke Association funded Jane Mortley and her work creating software and testing out that software here for people with aphasia. And if there's, I think most of you are speech therapists, but if there's anyone who isn't, people with aphasia have often had a stroke, and they struggle to understand what people are saying to them, and to talk, and to read, and to write. And that software, over time, developed through Jane and Peter's, her husband Peter's business, into the very well-known and well-used step-by-step programme, which continues to evolve because they just keep trying to make it as good as possible for the benefit of people with aphasia. And I'm going to just hand over to some people with aphasia, just for them to describe to you what it's like to have that condition that the step-by-step software aims to treat.
Having aphasia, you have so many things to say, but you can't say them. It's awful, because we can't get your words out. And the comp's gone.
For me, the worst thing about aphasia is the fact that you cannot communicate in a fully meaningful manner. And I find that Cheryl also finds that that is very difficult.
familiar with the idea that if you want to get better at doing anything, you need to practice. And that's no different if you want to learn to talk or relearn to talk after a stroke. And as speech and language therapists, many of you will be familiar with the term dose and intensity and things like that, which are essentially ways of us thinking about how we help our patients to have sufficient practice to be able to improve their language again. The difficulty is very often that as time goes on, certainly people on the NHS, which is where the majority of people access their speech and language therapy, they find it quite difficult sometimes to find speech and language therapy as more and more time goes past after their stroke. And this is despite the fact that many people with aphasia want to carry on practicing, they want to keep learning and keep on getting better at saying more. And a little bit more video here of some people with aphasia and a therapist just explaining that very issue.
She had somebody coming in virtually every other day, and then it suddenly dropped to once a week, and then there was nothing.
It went too fast. One minute they think, oh, get that, and then you get no one coming in.
There's a real drive for clients to be getting 45 minutes a day at the early stages, but we know that we need to look at still clients long term, but in terms of offering anything sort of longer term post-stroke, it needs to be in a sustainable way because our staffing resources are limited.
So in Jane Mortley's own speech therapy practice, she uses the step-by-step programme within a particular approach to be able to deliver lots and lots of practice time. So the approach that Jane uses is that there's a speech and language therapist to assess the person with aphasia and understand what their difficulties are and then tailor the software appropriately for them. Then the person with aphasia can practice at home on their computer as much as they can. And there's often then a volunteer, or it might be a family member, who helps the person to practice, helps them use the computer, and also feeds back to the speech therapist. So when I first went down to see Jane at work and to see the software, I saw this approach and thought, this is fantastic. Wouldn't it be great if everybody could have access to this kind of therapy, really, across the country? And so we went on to do a series of research studies that are known as CACTUS, and that stands for the Clinical and Cost Effectiveness of Aphasia Computer Therapy. The diagram I've put up here is the Medical Research Council's framework for complex interventions, and it shows how the research process happens through from a really good idea through from trying to get that evaluated and getting that into widespread use. And I also like to think of this as how we grew the CACTUS. So it started here at the Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit with Jane, and then went on with more development through STEP Consulting. So it was really here that the seeds were planted, I think, and that development work and the development of that approach and the testing out of that happened. At Sheffield University, we then got some funding from the National Institute for Health Research through their Research for Patient Benefit programme to do the first CACTUS project, which was about testing out whether that same approach could be used by other people, and just really trying to find out whether it's possible to do a bigger study. And during that work, we also did an interview study. So we interviewed people who were using this approach as part of that therapy to see what they thought of it. And generally, the patients and their relatives liked this way of working, and it was acceptable to them. So we went on to a larger evaluation stage and got a significant amount of funding from the Health Technology Assessment Programme to enable us to run a large evaluation which we called Big CACTUS. And that's what I'm going to talk more about now in the rest of my talk this evening. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about the exact intervention that we tested within this study. So we could, just for reference for the rest of my slides, we call CSLT is standing for Computer Speech and Language Therapy. And why did we do it? Well, the intervention's there, as I say, to increase the amounts of speech and language therapy that people can get. And it was for word finding in particular, because of the fact that many people with aphasia have word finding difficulties. We also wanted to adhere to principles of neuroplasticity, so the process by which the brain learns and changes, relearns. And the things that are important to that are salience, so the things people are practicing need to be meaningful to them. They need to do lots of repetition, so as much as possible, hence the intensity. And it's also good if they can have feedback, so they know whether what they're saying is accurate or not. And the step-by-step software delivers on all these neuroplasticity principles. So people did their word-finding exercises on a computer with the software. It was speech and language therapists working within the NHS context that provided that software, and there were also speech therapy assistants and or volunteers who supported that practice and helped people to try and practice those words in conversation as well. So therapy is essentially a self-managed form of therapy because people were doing that practice on their own at home majority of the time, and we recommended that they practiced for at least 20 to 30 minutes every day, and we measured how well they did with that over a 6-month period of time. The speech and language therapists tailored the exercises that people were doing, so they selected different exercises from the step-by-step programme that matched what the difficulties were that they were seeing on the initial language assessments. They also worked with the people with aphasia and their family members to come up with 100 words that the people thought would make a difference to their lives if they were able to say them, because this is what they used in their practice. And we trained the speech and language therapists on what we wanted them to try and deliver, and there was a manual that they could also look at to try and deliver the same thing. And you can find the manual at that website if you'd like to look at it. So in the big study we used a randomised controlled trial design, and I think there's 2 things that are particularly important to understand about the exact type of randomised controlled trial that we conducted. So firstly, it was a pragmatic randomised controlled trial, and that means that we wanted to evaluate how well the intervention worked in usual care conditions, so under the conditions that people would normally be delivering it within the NHS. The other thing that's important to note is that we weren't comparing this computer speech therapy to usual speech therapy, so it wasn't either or, because we wanted the computer speech therapy to give people more than they were currently getting, not give it instead. So we evaluated it in addition to anything people were already receiving on the NHS. So at the beginning of the study, people had language assessments conducted, and then they were randomly allocated to one of 3 groups. So they either got the computer therapy that I've just described, in addition to whatever else they were already getting, or they got their standard speech and language therapy, which may have been something, it may have been nothing, in another group. And then we had a 3rd group called an attention control, an activity control group. And the reason for this group being there was that if we saw that the computer therapy group did better than the usual care group, we wanted to know if that was because of the speech and language therapy bits of the therapy that the computer was delivering, or whether it was just because people were doing more work with their brains and having more attention. And so our attention control group received puzzle books, so they were asked to do a puzzle every day. So that was things like Sudoku, it might have been a word search. I quite like the Spot the Difference books myself. People might have done colouring in, anything like that. And they also had a researcher phoning them up every month to give some general support, so that's sort of mimicking or controlling for the support that the computer therapy patients were getting from the volunteer. Speech and language therapists who didn't know which intervention, which group the people had been allocated to, carried out outcome measures at 6 months, so at the end of the therapy period, and then again at 9 and 12 months. So our statisticians worked out that we needed around 285 people with aphasia in this study in order for us to be confident in the results. And once I picked myself up off the floor, we set about engaging different speech and language therapy departments in this work. And so we had 21 different speech and language therapy departments across the country, and you can see where they all were there. This also meant working with 21 different NHS IT departments. And Yvonne said to me on the phone, "How did you do that?" And I can't really think of a sensible answer other than I remember eating a lot of cake and drinking just a little bit of gin. And we really, I could probably think of how we did it, but that's my main memory. And we got there. So the people that we recruited into the study, we were looking for adults who'd had strokes, people who were over 18. They had to have had their stroke at least 4 months ago, because we were looking for those people who might be coming to the end of having, anyway, sort of intensive therapy that the NHS might be able to provide. They needed to have a diagnosis of aphasia made by their speech and language therapist with word finding difficulties. And we also needed people to be able to carry out a simple matching task that was within the step-by-step programme. And that was so that we knew that they could see the computer sufficiently to be able to use it, and so that we knew that they could manipulate it really, so they could work on their own. We had two main things that we wanted to try and find out about this therapy delivered in this way. The first was whether the computer-delivered speech and language therapy could increase people's ability to find those words that they identified as being meaningful for their lives. And so we gave them naming tests at all those different assessment time points. We also wanted to know whether people got generally better at having conversations as a result of the therapy as well. And I'm sure many people will know it's actually just really quite difficult to know how best to measure conversation. It's a very complex thing to look at and to measure. There's many different ways of doing it. In our study, we had our speech and language therapists having conversations so 10-minute conversations with the person with aphasia, and those conversations were videoed. The conversations were structured around the topics that they'd shown an interest in. So, and that was identified by what words people had chosen. So essentially, we were giving people the opportunity to be able to use their new words in conversation. Then we had a group of about 16 speech and language therapists who weren't involved in any other way in the study, rating those videos, so they didn't know which group the person was from or which time point that video was taken at. And they used the activity scale from the aphasia scale of the therapy outcome measures to measure those videos. So some other things we wanted to know was what the people with aphasia thought themselves, so whether they felt that their communication had improved any, and whether their quality of life had changed. And we used a patient-rated outcome measure for that called the COAST. I said that we used the TOMS to measure whether people were generally better at having conversation. We also wanted to know whether people used the specific words that they practiced in conversation. And so for this, we had some researchers watching all the videos and sitting with a tick list and literally counting off every time they heard a word spoken at each of the different time points. Another thing we wanted to know such a lot, I think. We probably wanted to know more than we looked at, but we wanted to know whether this intervention only improved the words that people practiced, or whether it also improved finding words that people hadn't practiced. And for this we used the naming objects section of the comprehensive aphasia test. And finally, going back to that idea that Anna, the therapist on the film, talked about in terms of sustainability, it was important for us to see if we could work out whether it was cost effective. And we needed to have a quality of life measure there, which we use called the EQ5D, which is a measure that health economists prefer us to use. And we adapted that so that people with aphasia could complete it by themselves. And then we also collected all the different costs that went into providing the therapy this way on the NHS. So, we recruited 275 participants in the end, and those of you who have memories from my previous slide will realise that's a few short of our target of 285. But we'd assumed that quite a few more people would drop out along the way than they did. So because we didn't have such a high dropout rate from the study, 275 was still fine for us to be confident in the result. 61% were male, so a bit over half, and quite a big age range. The youngest person was 23 and the oldest was 92. And I was pleased that we had quite a range in terms of the severity of word finding. So a lot of studies you'll find exclude people with severe aphasia. So I was quite pleased that we did manage to have some people with severe aphasia in the study, as well as the moderate and mild people. And again, a big range on how far post-stroke people were, so from 4 months to 36 years. And the interquartile range, so the middle 50% of people were between 1 and 4 years after their stroke. So what do people do? Well, given that opportunity with the computer to practice, on average, people use the computer for 28 hours over that 6-month period. Again, the interquartile range, so the middle 50% of people did between 15 and 50 hours. And again, a huge range, so we didn't record any practice time for some participants, and one person used it for as much as 105 hours. So quite variable in terms of what people choose to do. One of the things that I think was also quite important that we saw here is that we also were looking at how much usual care or usual speech and language therapy people got over the same time period. And on average, people received 3.8 hours in 6 months. And so that just goes to show how much more people were practicing with the computer than without access to it. We also found that 61% of people, if they were able to do the work on their own computer, or if they were able to continue borrowing a computer from the NHS, they carried on practicing after the end of that period of time that we were asking them to practice in. And I think this really shows that a lot of people, they want to do it, they want to carry on. They could have stopped at that point, but many people didn't. So did it improve word finding? Well, this graph here shows the green line at the top is the computer group. And you can see that kind of steep incline there, and you can see that the word finding in people in the computer group, yes, it did improve a lot more than the word finding of the people in the usual care and attention control groups. In fact, I can remember these figures sadly, it improved in the computer group by 16.2% more than the usual care group. Word finding in the computer group also improved by 14.4% more than the attention control group. And that's really important for us to know, because that gives us confidence that that improvement that we were seeing is due to the speech and language therapy that the computer was delivering, and not just the increase in the sort of activity people were doing with their brains and the attention they were getting. So I think that's quite an important finding. You can see that that improvement stayed there at 9 and 12 months. It carried on, it wasn't short-lived. We also found that the length of time people were post-stroke didn't actually matter. So people who were many years post-stroke in this study did as well as people who were earlier on for naming. So what about conversations? Did we see any improvement in general conversation? So this graph shows the results on the TOM scores at the group level, and you can see there that none of the three groups, we didn't really detect much of a change in general conversation in any of the three groups across time. But did we see whether people actually used the specific words in conversation? Well, again, if we compare at the group level, we didn't see much difference between the groups in terms of the computer therapy group actually using their words more in conversation than the other groups. But if we look on an individual basis, we saw that 3 out of 10 people in the computer group did use more of the words they were learning in conversation than the usual care and attention control groups. There was only 1 in 10 people who used more words there. So there's something in this that we need to look at further, because there are obviously some people who do learn words from a computer and use them in their daily lives. And we need to unpack that a bit more and look at, well, who are these people and what did they do differently? Did they use the software differently in some way, or did they use it more? Are they different in some ways? Is there something different about them? And we need to look at that, because that hopefully will be the key to us understanding how to help more people to use their words in their everyday lives. So what about people's own perceptions of their communication and their quality of life? Well, I mean, what we see here is that the graphs go up and down a little bit, but there was no added improvement on the COAST rating scale in the computer group from the other two groups. And this was a bit disappointing, actually, because when we did the interviews, if you remember I said at the beginning of my talk, we interviewed people about what it was like to use this therapy, and we saw quite a lot of people talking about generalisation and how they use the words in daily life. So this was about a lady who was saying that she'd learnt the word avocado on the computer, and she went out and bought an avocado from the back of the market stall every week because she could now ask for it. Also, a lot of people talked about how their confidence had improved when we talked them through interviews. I tend to think confidence is quite related to quality of life. And so it's interesting that we didn't see those things people told us about verbally. We didn't see them reflected in the rating scale. And I think this is something for speech and language therapy researchers to pick up on, as well as how do we best measure quality of life? I mean, again, it's a very nebulous thing, really important that we work out how to measure it, but I think we might not be quite there yet, and there's more work there to be done. What about the words people didn't practice? Were they any better at saying those? This graph shows that, in fact, all three groups over time improved very slightly in their ability to find general words they hadn't practiced on, which is encouraging in some ways. But we didn't see any added improvement of the people who were doing the word finding therapy. And I think really what's important here is that what we can see is that word finding practice helps people to get better at saying what they practice saying. And to me, what this is showing is certainly the long-term post-stroke, we're treating people, we're helping people to find specific words again. We're not necessarily helping a whole word-finding process come back. That's what this data would suggest anyway. And so it's really important that when we're doing word-finding therapy, we work with words that are going to be meaningful for people's everyday lives. I said we had a first go at measuring cost effectiveness. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but the main conclusion from a lot of work that the health economists did was that this was unlikely to be cost effective for absolutely everybody with aphasia, but it's more likely to be cost effective for people who had mild or moderate aphasia. Now, it's very interesting working with health economists actually, and I couldn't decide whether what they're doing is very complicated or whether it's all smoke and mirrors. I don't know what you think. But they measured this in a lot of different ways, and it seemed to me that every different way they measured it, they got a slightly different answer. And so because of this, I think this result is an indication, but it's not really a definitive result. That's how I would summarise it at the moment. And again, so a bit more work to be done there, but it was a first look at that. So the actual costs, the computer therapy cost £733 per patient. Now that is actually a very low healthcare cost. And it's half the cost doing it that way than if we delivered that average of 28 hours using a Band 6 speech and language therapist time. I've put a graph there of all the different things that cost when we deliver this kind of intervention. And I think it's easy for us to think if we're doing computer therapy, the cost is a computer and the software. But what this shows is if you're supporting that computer therapy, you're tailoring it and supporting it, there's also the costs of the speech and language therapists, assistants, volunteers, their time, their travel time and things like that to go into the mix. Now, you'll notice that the highest cost here is that of the speech and language therapist. Now, this can probably come down quite a bit actually, because within the trial, we had speech and language therapists putting all the words onto the computer, and actually perhaps it would be just as okay to have volunteers and assistants doing that, and perhaps we don't need to use more expensive time of speech therapists. The cost could come down a bit by having that done by other people. I also know that these results came out about a year ago, and Jane and Peter don't sit still, so I know the software today looks quite different to how it was in the trial, and Peter's made it even easier for therapists to tailor, and so it should be quicker, and so those time costs should be coming down over time. So that's an overview of what we found, and I'll just summarise what the implications are of this work clinically. So I think we can see that self-managed computer therapy, it can help people with aphasia to learn new, personally relevant words for months and for years after their stroke. So if people want to have a go at learning more, there's really no reason why they shouldn't, and I think that's a really important message. We can see that lots of people are willing and able to practice and do therapy this way with a computer to get those practice hours up. I've just shown you that it's important to use personally relevant words in therapy, and I think that probably goes for all word finding therapy, not just that on a computer. So this computer approach is really useful, I think, as part of speech and language therapy provision, because what it does is, we've seen from this trial that it increases those hours of repetitive practice, and we've seen that that in turn improves people's word finding of personally relevant words that they practice. But we've also shown that we can't just automatically assume that if people do word finding therapy on a computer, that they will automatically go on to use those words in their everyday lives. And so we need both as clinicians and as researchers, we need to think about ways of supporting people to use the words they learn to make a difference in their everyday lives. So that's where we're at. I want to come back to my video clips. I've inserted quite a few because I've just learned how to do it. And just give you the view of some of the people with aphasia who took part in the study, what they thought about the therapy and the trial. And Jenny, this first lady, is a great advert. So.
Asked me if I'd do this trial, the Sheffield University, and the CACTUS it was. Hello, and it was brilliant. It was brilliant. It was really good because I could understand these words, not straight away, but mostly I could get them in sentence, and I could get them. Whatever you've got to do, 20 minutes in whatever time you've got to do. I'd always got an hour at least to do it. and absolutely swatted it. I loved it because I loved it, you see, and that made me more lovely. It made me more determined to keep going.
So we're trying to use the software now at all stages of the client's journey, but what it presents is this really nice opportunity for those clients who remain motivated, who are continuing to show progress, even perhaps a couple of years post-stroke, and that will probably be the time that services are under that pressure to look at discharge with people. But if we can set that client up with a programme that they can continue to do with minimal SLT input, that's what's really favourable to us. And I think that helps clients with that idea that, they haven't necessarily reached a plateau, that they can continue to improve in the future, and they've got that level of control and independence in their rehabilitation.
I don't think you could beat having a professional come in with you, but then you can't have a professional with you 24 hours a day. So I think the programme is helpful in as much as it kick-started her again.
Hello? What is it? Sorry? What is it? Oh!
Just recently, she's been able to felt comfortable, or it's just natural to her now. Maybe it's weight coming back a bit more. She can have a polite conversation with somebody, and that's good to see. So, I believe it all started basically with that programme.
Great advert. The video clips I've used through my talk are from a film we made with our PPI group at the end of the trial, and if you're interested in watching the whole film, it's just 20 minutes long, and you can get hold of it at that web address. I'll just pause there, because you might not be able to write that back. We also have some booklets of the results. Again, you can find some of those to download in PDF form there if you want any more, but there's some dotted around upstairs and down here. And it's designed for, if you want to know quite a bit about one of the things in the study, then you read this page. If you want a summary, or for people with aphasia, there's an aphasia-friendly and accessible page on that side, summarising that information. So if any of you have any patients you think might be interested, do take a couple to show them as well. So as Yvonne said, this was a big study, and what I've learned through doing it is that the real key thing for me was collaboration. No one person or no two people have all the skills required to do a study like this, and so it's speech therapy research. It isn't just for a few researchers, it's for all of us, it's everybody's business. We needed the investment from our funders. We needed to work closely in this study with our software developers, Jane and Peter. We worked very closely as well with people with aphasia and their carers for them to keep us on the straight and narrow with this study. Academics, lots of different academics. As I say, we work with health economists, statisticians, data managers, people who know how to get ethics permission. All those people are really important. But last, by no means least, are the speech and language therapists that were involved in this study. So there's just a few of them here with their CACTUS passport photographs. We had over 80 speech and language therapists involved in this study around the country at different times. And some of them had done a bit of research before, some of them had never done research before, but everyone had something to contribute. Although obviously the purpose of doing research is a very serious one, to try and improve the lives of people with communication disability, we had quite a lot of fun, to be perfectly honest, as you can see here. I think for many people it was quite a rewarding experience. And this is just a tweet from Amit Kulkarni, our research manager at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, talking to a couple of the therapists involved who are our big CACTUS end event. So if speech therapists in the audience, if you haven't been involved in research and you're interested, just get involved. It's a lot of fun and you can learn as you go. So where next? I've got at the top here academic papers, which isn't my favourite subject at the moment, but we need to write academic papers about this. We need to get them into good journals, and not just, you know, for the sake of it, certainly not for the good of our health, but because, sorry, I'm feeling a bit bitter, but because when people write clinical guidelines and recommendations, this is where they go. They go to the research journals to pick up the evidence, to provide those recommendations for therapists, for people who deliver speech and language therapy, but almost more importantly, for people who fund speech and language therapy. So we need to get the message out there that this is a way of doing it, and please invest in this. There's always ongoing software development. As I say, there's changes have happened already, and will continue to, I'm sure. We need to do more research. We need to know who this works best for, who are the best people to be offering this to, and who needs face-to-face still. And we need to work out how to help people use those words in their lives, as I've said. And finally, Pam alluded to it at the beginning of the evening, but it's that research can be over here and clinical practice can be over here, and this research journey often stops at the point of evaluation. So we know what works, so the knowledge is there, but translating the knowledge into practice and implementing that into so that people can benefit everywhere can take a bit of time and often doesn't happen easily. So the implementation stage of the research journey is where we need to go next. And there's now a whole science around this called implementation science, and one of the things we can do through that is work out what factors affect this being taken up. What, you know, how can we ease that process? Again, Jane and Peter are doing a study called CHAT, which is an implementation project with speech and language therapy services in Northern Ireland to optimise services using technology. And I think it would be rather nice if we could perhaps do some more implementation work with Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit and bring this back full circle to where it started. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit for everything you've done over the years for people with communication difficulties, and a personal thank you from me for influencing and inspiring my own research journey. Happy birthday, and here's to the next 30 years.
Brilliant, and that was everything that I knew it was going to be. I actually really enjoyed that. We're not going to have questions now because there'll be time to chat a little bit later on over more drinks and food. There's quite a bit of food there, if you hadn't noticed. But I'm going to hand over to another previous... yeah, I am. I'm going to hand it over to Prof Sue Roulstone now, another previous director of the research unit.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. That was such a fantastic presentation. I just want to say, to start off with, I was a director of the unit with my co-director Brian. We followed on from Pam until about 2013, but we pop out of the woodwork now and again with Brian. We're still sort of hanging around here, finding it difficult to get rid of us, really. But first of all, I'd just like to comment a bit more on Rebecca's amazing presentation. Thank you for doing that. Our first inaugural lecture. That was really great. You set a great standard for the rest of the future for people to follow, so that's fantastic. We found it particularly inspiring hearing about the big CACTUS study back here in the unit, as you've explained and Pam mentioned, and you know that kind of history from its early beginnings here with Pam and Brian starting off the aphasia therapy with the use of computers, and then Jane and Peter developing the study here in the early days, and Jane getting her PhD here, and seeing it kind of progress to a stage when we're we're really building the evidence base for a piece, an idea that started off as a small idea. It's grown into this huge thing now and a huge study. It's really inspiring to hear that. It's also pretty amazing to see an RCT being delivered to such a standard in speech and language therapy. You know, it's still said about RCTs that you can't do them in speech therapy. It's too difficult, it's not appropriate. But actually, you and your team in Sheffield and all the therapists who've been part of that have proved them wrong. So congratulations on a really amazing piece of work. It's very impressive. I think your persistence as well is a good lesson for us all. You don't kind of become a researcher in speech therapy if you're faint of heart. And Rebecca has shown that, that kind of following things through, and Jane and Peter, that kind of continuation of working on this software. It's gone on and on and on, and it takes a long time. And that persistence is a kind of lesson for us all. And Pam, in the same way, if you think of Pam's therapy outcome measures, for goodness sake, Pam developed those when she was in Bristol quite a long time ago, 40 years ago. And during that time since then, she's been accumulating evidence about their reliability, their validity, data about how they operate in terms of tracking the change of people in therapy. And now we have RCSLT, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, saying, yes, TOMs are the outcome measure, the generic outcome measure of choice for the profession, and developing a national online tool that delivers those outcome measures. Amazing, the persistence of that, to stick with something for so long, but to see it come to fruition. And things take that long to get from that gem of an idea through to its implementation in practice, and we really do have to be prepared to stick with it. So we've got some inspirational researchers in speech therapy who really set the bar about what we need to do to be effective as researchers. So thank you to Rebecca and to Pam for your inspiration over the years, and to Jane and Peter too. So the unit's had some inspirational researchers here, but we've had a lot of help too, and a lot of help and support. And it's my job to say a few thank yous, really. So I want to start off by just saying thank you to our funders, the people who trust us with their money. But more than trusting us with their money, I'd like to acknowledge the value that we attach to their belief in the research for people with communication disorders. We're such a Cinderella area of research. It's so difficult to get funding. So we really appreciate the funders who are committed to this area of research. We've had funding from MRC, from the NIHR, from Stroke Association, from BUPA, from all kinds of things. But the Underwood Trust has stuck with us in the unit for many years, and we really appreciate that. That's been a great source of encouragement and also financial stability over the years. And also for North Bristol NHS Trust. They weren't called out when Pam set up the unit, but again, they've stuck with the unit over all that time, and they've hosted us and continued to support us, and we really appreciate that. I'd also like to acknowledge the patients, the children and the adults with communication disorders who participate in our research. They volunteer for our research, they stick their neck out and they get involved, and we really appreciate that, as well as their families and the practitioners who work with them. We couldn't do this kind of research unless we had those volunteers. We really appreciate them too. We've had a lot of really good collaborators nationally, locally, nationally and internationally, and we learn from each collaboration that we go into. And I want to particularly say thank you to the researchers and staff at the unit itself. It's a really fantastic place to work. There's lots of enthusiasm, commitment, that perseverance, which is absolutely vital to the unit. But a really collegiate approach. It's a really positive and stimulating place to work. And I want to say congratulations to all of them. There's lots of faces here. I see people who, I was going to say old faces, that's not true. Familiar faces of people who have been at the unit over the years. And congratulations, because it's a fantastic body of work of applied speech and language therapy research that has evolved here. And the unit has really gone from strength to strength. It's broadened its remit, so from the early days of stroke and neurological acquired disorders, it's now broadened to include developmental speech and language disorders, stammering, alternative and augmentative communication disorders, and more recently the work that Yvonne and Lucy are doing with cleft lip and palate. So we've got a much broader remit. There's also some exciting things in PPI with patient and public involvement. It's great, the work that Rebecca has done is fantastic. The unit is getting into this in quite a big way in terms of their links with, for example, the Cleft Lip and Palate Association. So we're working with our patient groups and public groups to understand their research questions. We need to know what they value, what their issues are, in order to make sure that the research that is carried out is relevant, has impact, is valued by the people that we're researching. We're doing it on their behalf, really. I think the other thing now, we see new researchers coming into the unit, so we're expecting several new researchers to be joining us over the coming year. So we're continuing to grow as a unit. The collaborations between Newcastle and with Sheffield are going to be strengthened in the coming years. So it's continuing to grow and to improve and increase its remit. That publication process that Rebecca referred to, it is the bane of everybody's life, I think, having to make those efforts. But the publication rate of the unit is pretty good for such a small group. And I'm particularly pleased that Yvonne mentioned the book, which I thought I had a copy of. I've got a this is a great little book. I'm going to do a big plug for it now.
You are.
Thank you. I'd like to do a big plug for it, because it really is a fantastic book. It's full of sound advice for how you get into speech and language therapy research. If you're considering doing speech and language therapy research as a new researcher, this really does give you the kind of steps you need to go through. It's a great little book. And it's pretty good for people like me who've been around for a few years who need to kind of remind themselves of what's going on and what the new issues are as well. So it's a great book. The publishers are out there. You can get it for a reduced fee today. There's getting rid of them on sale. So please do go and talk to the publishers about the other books they've got on offer. J&R Press are a great supporter of our field, actually, and it's really interesting to look at their portfolio of books. So, finally, I want to say a big thank you to all the people behind the scenes who made this possible, particularly Faye, who I've noticed she's shot out already. So I'll say thank you to her publicly anyway, for all the organisation that's gone on to make this possible. Thank you to you too for coming and supporting us. We really appreciate that. I've got one big favour left to ask you all. We'd like to raise some money from this event. It is a free event, but we felt it was an appropriate thing to do, to try and raise money to say thank you on this occasion to one of our supporters. So we're hoping to raise some money for the Stroke Association. And so in order to do that, we've made some little cakes and biscuits. So please, when you go out that way. Help yourself to some more food and to one of the cakes and biscuits, and pay generously for them. So, thank you again for coming. Please stay at the network. There's loads more food left and cake. Have a look at the publisher's stand and take the opportunity to speak with Rebecca and other members of the team. So finally, can you all join with me again in thanking Rebecca and complimenting her on a fantastic first Underwood Trust Lecture. Thank you, everybody.